Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Jacques Baud, who is a former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service. So welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
So there's been big developments in the Ukraine proxy war. It's again, some people greet this with great optimism. Others are more skeptical that this could be another ploy to impose a ceasefire, which would then become another Minsk agreement to simply freeze the conflict, that is, freeze collapsing front lines, to give NATO some time to rearm Ukraine and again fight another day. But again, I'm not completely convinced this is the case. There's been some interesting rhetoric changing. Indeed, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that there would perhaps have to be a de facto recognition that Russia controls Ukrainian territory. I was wondering how you read this whole summit, because it kind of took a lot of people, including myself, by surprise.
Well, absolutely. I think before discussing really the core of what you just asked, just want to open a parenthesis regarding Minsk. We hear a lot that it could be a Minsk 3 or something like that. I think it's important to understand that the Minsk agreement was not a treaty between Ukraine and Russia. It was an agreement between Kiev and the two republics of the Donbas. And the aim of the Minsk was not to freeze the conflict. I think it's very important to understand that. The objective of the Minsk agreement was to provide autonomy of those regions and to start some constitutional reforms within Ukraine, and from these reforms to grant some form of autonomy to the regions. That's the Minsk agreement. It was not about freezing the conflict, even if obviously in order to achieve that, it was also the idea that the hostilities should be stopped and all that. But I think it's very important to understand that the core aspect of these agreements was the constitutional reform, which both the Westerners and, of course, Ukraine didn't want to address. And for that reason, the whole thing failed. But coming back to your question, I think today we are a little bit back to the situation we had in March this year, because we have obviously Donald Trump willing to solve, I mean, not solve the situation. I think, again, here we have to be very careful with the words. He wants to find, let's say, clean exit ramp to the conflict. So he doesn't want to get out of the conflict as Joe Biden did for Afghanistan in 2021. He wants to leave the conflict and having some calm when he leaves the conflict. I think it's very important. So, and when you see what he suggests or what he talks about, it's never about peace, really. It's about ceasefire. And by the way, it's very important also to understand, and that's also something we had earlier since in fact June last year. The only ones who speak about peace are the Russians, because what they want is a solution to the problem. In the framework of that process of finding peace, you may have a ceasefire. And the starting point of this process is exactly as Vladimir Putin said on the 14th of June 2024, is the declaration of Ukraine that he will abandon the idea of joining NATO, and he would withdraw from the four regions of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. That's the starting point of the process. And the second step of this process is to enter a ceasefire. And this ceasefire should not be the opportunity for both parties to rearm and prepare for new hostilities. But in fact, this ceasefire should serve as basis for a dialogue and negotiations, which eventually should lead to peace. So the only ones who have presented such a process are the Russians. Ukrainians don't want to engage in any kind of negotiation. In fact, there have been pushed or forced into negotiation by Donald Trump to some extent. Donald Trump himself, as we have seen, I mean, I don't know if I should say Donald Trump or his administration, but what we see is that in the last couple of months, we had every effort to impose some variant or form or variation of the Keith Kellogg plan, which essentially is about freezing the conflict, but not really finding a solution. Freezing, first of all, on the front line of the line of contact, and as to NATO, it's not even finding a solution for that, because it's about freezing the situation and postpone the idea of for Ukraine joining NATO at a later stage in 10 or 20 years, depending on the variant. So these plans, and if we look at the French, the Europeans and the Ukrainians, the best, the closest to an agreement they are ready to engage in is in fact just a ceasefire without any condition, meaning that it's a ceasefire hanging in the air that leads to no, which is not integrated in a process as the Russians are looking for. And it's basically a ceasefire that just, in fact, allow to rearm and to refurbish arms and things like this. It's interesting that in the European rhetoric, and that's very clear when you hear Emmanuel Macron, for instance, he equates ceasefire to peace, even if they also acknowledge that the ceasefire is temporary, that it doesn't provide a solution, and ultimately the region that have been conquered by Russia should be retaken by Ukraine. So the ceasefire is temporary, is absolutely no peace. But in the European narrative, they say Putin doesn't want a ceasefire because he doesn't want peace. So that's a distortion of terms, which is quite interesting. But essentially, this is the scene. And we have now Trump, who wants to get out of the conflict, and therefore he would like to have some kind of settlement, which is probably not even a peace agreement, but just a temporary settlement. But in order to achieve that, he has to convince Vladimir Putin that he wants precisely a temporary solution somehow. And that's where Keith Kellogg failed in presenting. I mean, that was his plan was rejected by the Russians. And surprisingly, we have Steve Witkoff, who apparently had, several hours of discussion with Vladimir Putin, but apparently was not able to understand exactly what the Russians wanted. And that's the most surprising thing in the whole story, if you want, because I expected Steve Witkoff to have understood what the Russians wanted, and that you had some thoughts within the Western party, US, Europe, and things like that, in order to see how we can accommodate the Russian demands and the Ukrainian demands. This has not happened. So what I see today is that, as he attempted in March, Donald Trump wants to try to convince probably Vladimir Putin to change his mind. That's, again, I don't know what they will talk, but that's the best scenario, that the worst scenario, that he tries to convince Putin, because that will fail, because the Russians have been already burned by what they experience with the Minsk agreement, with the 3 different attempts to have negotiation. You remember in February 2022, March 2022, and then August 2022. All these attempts failed due to the European intervention, and the Russians now don't want to talk for nothing. They want to talk for a result. And this result, since they are winning on the ground, they try to impose their view on the solution. And all efforts of Trump to make Putin changing his mind, in my view, I mean, again, I cannot anticipate, I don't have a crystal ball, but my feeling is that he will engage into failure. In the best case, he will try to understand what Putin wants, and he will then take that to talk to Zelensky, because apparently what has apparently been decided is that he will first have a bilateral meeting between Trump and Putin, and then a second bilateral meeting between Trump and Zelensky. And in the best case, Trump understands what Vladimir Putin wants, and he tries to negotiate that or try to convince Zelensky to find some to accommodate these views. This is how I see things, and I think the Americans started or had in mind to do the same thing in March, although they had at that time an additional problem that was to rebuild kind of a diplomatic dialogue. And in fact, if we read readout and transcripts of the various negotiation or discussions between US and Russia in early March, I mean in March basically, it was mostly focused on the reestablishment of a normal diplomatic relation, with including all the technicalities of that, including the restoration of the Russian embassy in Washington D.C. and all these kind of things. So it was very much a technical thing. But interestingly enough, at that time, even this discussion that was essentially a bilateral issue about diplomatic relation, that was very poorly interpreted by the Europeans, who saw here an attempt of Trump to negotiate peace over the head of Zelensky and, of course, of the European. I think it has never been the real idea of Trump. That's my personal interpretation. He probably tried to impose a solution, tried to impose this Keith Kellogg plan, but at the end of the day, the idea was that at the end, he would play or act as a mediator, even if it's quite strange, because as we have said many times, US is a party of the conflict, and therefore it has not the features of a mediator. But here is the schizophrenia of Donald Trump is at play, because he can say, well, that was Biden's war and that will be Trump's peace. And therefore, he can detach himself from the action of the US government, the previous US government, and therefore he plays the game as an external actor, and therefore plays the role of a mediator. I think that's more or less the psychology of the whole thing. Whether good or not, whether effective or not, I don't know. The fact is that's what he wants to do. And as of today, as it was before, by the way, he is the only one who is in a position to do that. Because from the European side, there is no ability to talk to the Russians. There is no instrument for that. I mean, the European External Action Service, led by Kaja Kallas, is absolutely not tailored for this kind of thing. I mean, the Kaja Kallas, I mean, when I hear Kaja Kallas, I always come to my mind this say that when the only tool you have is a hammer, all the problems you have are nails. And for her, all the problems they have, whether it's China or whether it's India, it's always Russia. Regardless of the problems, always Russia. So it's not possible for such a person to engage into a honest diplomatic dialogue, and therefore you can forget about the Europeans, the Europe as an institution. And when you talk about people like Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz, or Emmanuel Macron, they have no credibility with the Russians. So there is, I mean, they are useless in that context. So the only possible mediation capability we have at this stage is Donald Trump, because he is willing to assume this role. So that's what we have now. So my view is that even if in Europe people tend to think that the peace cannot be negotiated without Ukraine and things like that, I think this is a little bit beyond the point at this stage, because regardless of what Trump and Putin will discuss, I think the idea is not to avoid Ukraine. It's simply to avoid, I mean, people realize that the relationship that exists between the different actors are not mature enough to allow a direct dialogue between Russia and Ukraine. And therefore, we need somehow to have someone, and that will be Trump in that case. That's probably not the best choice, but that's the person which is there in order to make the contact. And we will have this kind of what we tend to call the shuttle diplomacy, where you have Trump acting as the shuttle to talk to Putin and then to talk to Zelensky and to see what. That's how I figure out the process, and probably that's how the Russians see the problem, the process as well. So I think that's more or less what will happen. Whether or not we'll find a solution, this is another question. Again, I think the Russians stand firm on their position, and they have the advantage on the ground. There is no question about this. So now they made a suggestion, not a suggestion. They defined their position in June last year. They haven't changed their mind at all. What we have seen in the memorandum that was distributed by the Russians to the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul early June reflects exactly what Vladimir Putin said in June last year, but it was a little bit more, let's say, detailed, and you have kind of a script, if you want, of what the Russians are suggesting. But in essence, this is that Ukraine declares that it will not join NATO, it withdraws from the full region, and then we start a ceasefire, and out of this ceasefire should come a process to engage in proper peace negotiations. Because then, in that negotiation, the issue of the territories will not be discussed, in fact, because that's a condition to accept the negotiation as a result. The same as NATO will not be discussed because it's a condition to enter the negotiation. But what needs to be discussed are the consequence of that, meaning how we define security guarantees for Ukraine. And remember that in April last year, I mean, March, April last year, 2022, Ukrainians themselves proposed to not to join NATO, and instead having security guarantees around a number of guarantors, nations, among which Russia was, by the way. And you had these countries who would guarantee the security of Ukraine. And that's probably what Vladimir Putin contemplates. That's a similar agreement, but of course, in April 2022, such a solution was in exchange of the withdrawal of Russian forces. Today, this withdrawal of Russian forces is most probably excluded by the Russians, and therefore there will be the negotiation about security guarantees, but based on the new borders of the Russian Federation that include the four regions and, of course, Crimea. And I think Crimea is absolutely no discussion on the Russian side that this should stay within the jurisdiction of the Russian Federation. Also, for historical reason. I mean, I'm not talking about old historical, not the 17th century or things like that, but the very modern history of Ukraine. Since, as you know, in fact, it's de facto Ukraine that annexed Crimea in 1995, and the referendum in 2014 was in reality a reaction to the annexation of Crimea by Ukraine in 1995. And the basis of all that was the referendum that happened on the 20th of January 1991 that grants autonomy of Crimea and places Crimea under the jurisdiction of Moscow and no longer from Kiev. And that's the situation that prompted eventually 1995 Ukraine to annex Crimea. So I think for the Russians, Crimea is a case already solved. But the four region, obviously, there are some discussion about that, and I think that will be what you might. And by the way, when you hear the discussion on the freeze on the contact line or having the whole region, all that shows that the four region are still in question while Crimea is no longer.
I'm glad you mentioned that the Minsk agreement was between Ukraine and Donbas, because everything tends to, I think a key problem in terms of reaching a peace is we're not defining the conflict the same. That means also there's none of the same solutions. So, and this was during from 2015 to 2022. I remember the Europeans and Americans were always trying to redefine the conflict as between Ukraine and Russia. You know, Russia's not living up to Minsk, and the Russians had to over and over again remind them we're not part of the Minsk agreement. This is with Donbas and Ukraine. But this is still the problem. That is, what is this conflict now? Because for the Europeans, it's solely a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where one side is the aggressor, while Russia defines this as a conflict between NATO and Russia, in which the Ukrainians are used as a proxy. But this affects, I guess, how you view the war as well, or what peace means. Because when Zelensky says peace, he says, well, in any peace agreement, we still have to continue pressure and punishment of Russia, which is a strange peace. And the Europeans also say, well, we still have to keep the pressure on Russia, sanctions in place. We can't reward them with, the usual Hitler analogy. But again, if you think that this is a war between Ukraine and Russia, then peace in the European mind will have to be, the continued containment of Russia, proper security guarantees for Ukraine, don't reward aggression. This is the kind of recipe for peace. But if you recognize that this is also a war between NATO and Russia, then in the whole offense-defense debate, any security guarantees in Ukraine is a continued NATO warfare against Russia. So of course the Russians can't accept this, and so it just seems very stuck there. But it kind of begs the question, because you're a colonel and Swiss Army, you do the intelligence. And you say now 6 months into the Trump presidency that he doesn't necessarily understand what the Russians want. Are they, I mean, are they deceptive or are they fooling us, same as the Europeans? Because they must recognize that NATO is a part of this conflict. And the same with Trump when he keeps positioning himself as the mediator, arguing he wants to mediate a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. If this is the framework he has, there's no prospect of peace. And this is my concern. I only hear talk now about territory, but territory is a consequence of the war. But where's the talk about neutrality? Where's the talk about European security architecture? I'm just, are they trying to deceive us or they don't know any better? Because, American intelligence is quite good.
No, I think it's an excellent question you're asking, because in fact it's everybody is right. There is both a fight between a war between Russia and Ukraine, and at the same time it's a war between NATO and Russia. I think it's very important, and that's why we have to go back to the genesis of the conflict. And in my view, what we need to do is to go back to what Alexei Arestovich, the former advisor of Zelensky, what he said in March 2019. And I just want to show you, I don't want to show the whole the whole video, but I think it's important to understand what was the idea behind, because the Ukrainians in 2019 had the idea that what prevented Ukraine to enter NATO was the fact that they had an open conflict with Russia. And therefore, in order to make this conflict disappear, they needed to have an open war with Russia and defeat Russia. And because Russia would be defeated, then the problem would no longer exist. Ukraine would be victorious, and therefore it could enter NATO. Russia doesn't exist anymore to some extent. That was the idea. And when you listen to what Arestovich said in March 2019, it's exactly the kind of thinking that was at play at that time. And if we compare what Arestovich said in 2019, saying that the idea is becoming member of NATO as a result of winning against Russia, and you have exactly almost the same phrase said by Jens Stoltenberg in 5 years later, saying that to enter NATO, Ukraine must prevail against Russia. So we have this basic idea, and that is the rationale for Ukrainians to prepare an offensive against the Donbas in 2021. Remember this decree of Zelensky that Ukraine would be engaged in the reconquest of the south of the country and Crimea. And from that point on, you had this buildup of the Ukrainian forces around the Donbas. Basically, we see this line that was constructed at that time, and one of the last elements of that line is precisely Pokrovsk. And the idea was to attack Donbas, to provoke the Russian intervention, and then based on the massive sanctions of the West, Russia would simply collapse, the regime would collapse, the economy would collapse, and therefore Ukraine would have a clear victory against Ukraine. That was the rationale. And that's for that reason, that explains why in December, because the Russians obviously know what I knew at the time, and they knew that also. So, and when they made the proposal on mid-December 2021, it was about, in fact, saying to Ukraine, you will not be member to NATO. And I think that's the key point, because Ukraine had this idea to be member after a war. So saying clearly to Ukraine that he will never be member of NATO that would have prevented the war that was started in the Donbas in early February. I mean, that was the very start of the Ukrainian offensive was on the 16th of February 2022. And this saying that whatever Ukraine does, it will not be member of NATO, would have prevented that, and therefore would have prevented the Russians to engage in this military intervention. It's also important to remember, from an international law point of view, that Russia has never said it was intervening in Ukraine because of NATO. The rationale for intervening in Ukraine was to protect the population of Donbas, which was subject to this offensive that started on the 16th of February. And based on that event, that prompted on the 21st of February the recognition of the independence of the two republics by Russia, and the rationale for this, because you may remember that Vladimir Putin refused to recognize the independence of these two republics before that. But on the 21st of February, he changed his mind for one reason. That's very simple, because by granting by recognizing, not granting, but recognizing the independence of those two republics, it provided a basis for this republic to ask for military assistance based on a treaty of friendship and military assistance that was established on the 22nd of February 2022, that was ratified by the parliament of the Republic of Donetsk, the Republic of Lugansk, and the Duma of Moscow on the 23rd. And based on those treaties that were then ratified, the two republics could ask for military assistance to Russia, and Russia could then invoke the Article 51 of the UN Charter. And if you read the declaration of the Russian government on the 24th of February 2022, it invoked the Article 51 of the UN Charter that allows a coalition, if you want, between countries in order to protect the population of the two republics of the Donbas. And that was, in fact, not demonstrated, but witnessed by the observers of the OSCE, because they noted, and I made in my books, I reflected that, because I checked all the reports of the USA observers, and I know personally one of these observers of the OSCE at that time, who used to be in NATO at the time I was in NATO, and who confirmed exactly what I said. That means that on the 16th of February 2022, the Ukrainians started an intense shelling of the Donbas. And that was, for the Russians and for the Republic of Donbas, the indication that an offensive was ongoing, and that prompted the rest of the. So, therefore, it's important to understand, yes, the very basic reason remains the expansion of NATO. But the reason why the Russians intervened, legally speaking, is not NATO. Is the protection of civilians. And that's very important, because regardless of how we see NATO and how we consider the legality or illegality or legitimacy or illegitimacy of NATO action, this would as such not allow legally Russia to intervene in Ukraine. But the attack on civilians in Ukraine provides the fundamental reason to engage into a conflict. And again, this is something that has been defined in the so-called responsibility to protect, which is a principle of the United Nations. And you have three pillars, and the third of these pillars is when everything has failed, I mean, diplomatic initiatives and all that, when the only solution to prevent or to protect a population is military intervention, then it can be done under Article 51 of the UN Charter. So we have closed the circle, and we see that the whole process that the Russians engage in. That's why today you have, when we talk about the root causes of the conflict, it's in fact a two-pronged problem. And that's very important to understand. It is not just NATO. This is also the protection of population. And in the mind, as it was explained, by the way, by Sergei Lavrov, the idea of asking the Ukraine to withdraw from the four regions is not just for the sake of extending Russian territory. The idea behind this is to put the population of those regions under the protection of Russia. Why that? Again, if with the Russians, there's always a reason. The reason behind this is that on the 1st of July 2021, the Parliament of Ukraine adopted a law, the law on indigenous people, that grants different rights to the Russians as to the rest of the Ukrainian citizens. And therefore, this law makes a discrimination between the Russian, ethnic Russian citizens of Ukraine and the other citizens of Ukraine. And based on that law, which, by the way, at the time this was compared, when the law was adopted, it has been compared by some people, although we have to be careful with the comparison. But anyway, some people compared this law of 21 as like the Nuremberg laws of 1935 in Germany, that were set to make a discrimination between the ethnic Germans and those Germans who have been mixed with Jews, let's put it that way, to simplify the problem. And that was in essence to make a distinction between those Jews who had German citizenship and the Germans who had no Jews in their family. And so the essence of this law is basically that it grants different rights based not on what you do, but on what you are. And that's exactly what you have with this law of the 1st of July 2021. And this law, which, by the way, gave Vladimir Putin the opportunity to write an extremely long article on the 12th of July of the same year to explain that this law had no sense. But in the mind of the Russian, this law was extremely important. And today it's resurfaced in the sense that in order to protect the Russian population of Ukraine from this law, then we need to keep those four regions. That's the, let's say, legalistic rationale or explanation to these four regions. In addition to that, there will be the second prong of the root causes, which is that Ukraine should abandon the idea of being member of NATO, which in fact goes slightly further than what you had in the constitution of Ukraine. I think it was the constitution of 1992 or 1996, I don't remember, where in that constitution it was never a question of neutrality. It was not question about belonging to an alliance or not, but it was definitely written and defined or declared that Ukraine would not accept foreign forces or foreign troops on his territory, foreign troops or bases and installation, which some people interpret as neutrality. Well, we can give the interpretation, but the word neutrality is not in that constitution. In any case, what the Russians today have in mind is the return to that situation where Ukraine renounce to the NATO membership, because if you are a member of NATO, ipso facto, you will have troops on your territory, because that's the rationale of the alliance. So these are the two-pronged aspect, and therefore the territories, the demand, the Russian demand about territories, I mean the four regions, and the question of NATO, these are both together in this idea of the root causes. There is not one more than the other. The two are related. And for that reason, I doubt that Vladimir Putin would abandon these two conditions. And to me, that's explained. I mean, that probably leads this discussion, again, depending on how Trump reacts on that and all that. But I am a little bit skeptical about the result of the discussion, because I think the Europeans are not mature enough, or let's say their understanding of the conflict is not mature enough to understand that if they don't accept the proposal of Russia today, Russia will continue to advance, and Ukraine will be in a much worse position to negotiate in 6 months or 1 year or whatever. So that's a little bit the situation. I think it's important to understand all these relationships, because when you analyze the way the Russians address the problem, it's extremely systematic. There is a very strong logic in that. The problem is that in the West, we tend to look for shortcuts in understanding the whole thing. And we tend to NATO is a problem for Russia. But remember that when the Baltic states became members of NATO, Russia didn't invade them. You see, when Turkey in 1952 became member of NATO, Soviet Union didn't invade. The problem came when then the Americans started to deploy those missiles, the nuclear missile Jupiter, just in Turkey. And that generated the Cuba Missile Crisis. That's the whole process. So the Russians are extremely systematic. Yes, NATO is a problem, but the problem is that they understand that the whole purpose of expanding NATO is also to provide some kind of encirclement of Russia and to push in the case of Ukraine, to use or misuse Ukraine to achieve that objective. So Ukraine has been the accepting victim of that. This is sad, because I mentioned the discussion of Alexei Arestovich in March 2019, but in April 2019, you had a very extensive document extending Russia, provided by the RAND Corporation, that explains all that. And this document explained even that misusing Ukraine for the purpose of weakening Russia and provoke Russia would lead to a loss of territory. And I think I have even here the real here. I think for those who are interested, we can see that. This is this document of the RAND Corporation, and here you have that. However, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to US prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into disadvantageous peace. And that's just the chapter regarding the risk of the US policy of misusing Ukraine to weaken Russia. So the problem is that we tend to ignore all these elements, but in fact, it's part of a consistent strategy implemented by the US, more by NATO, NATO being just a tool of the US, let's be clear. And this was in fact something that has been clearly calculated from the very beginning, and the West took the risk of sacrificing Ukraine for the purpose of US hubris. And we are exactly in that situation today. The problem is that for 3 years or so, we had the Western narrative that was there saying that Putin is a bad guy, he wanted to invade all Ukraine and all that. Today, we come closer to the point in time and in location where the reality comes into contact to the narrative. And we are witnessing slowly the discrepancy we have between the narrative and the reality. And that's exactly in fact, the essence of the problem the US will face in Alaska, because the reality is exactly what the Russians have always said. And regardless of how we like or don't like Vladimir Putin, the fact of the matter is that they have been consistent from the very beginning. The West distorted the whole thing, including the Minsk agreement. And as you perfectly said before, it was a deliberate attempt to convert this domestic agreement of Minsk into an international agreement. And by the way, the French were key in trying to develop this narrative with the so-called Format Normandy, or the Normandy format, because that was a format that emerged during the anniversary of the D-Day landing in Normandy, where Vladimir Putin could meet with Poroshenko, Angela Merkel, and Macron. And the idea of Macron was, Hollande, pardon, sorry, that was François Hollande. And the idea was that this format could help to solve the crisis. But the issue is that in that circumstances in Normandy, you had only the head of state, and you had not the head of the republics on Donbas. And trying to solve the problem just with the head of state and forgetting about the Republic of Donbas was a distortion of the essence of the Minsk agreement. And that's for that reason the Russians always refused to discuss the matter of the Minsk agreement or the implementation of the Minsk agreement in the Normandy format, because that was the wrong audience for that. The Minsk agreement is something that should have been solved between Kiev, Lugansk, and Donetsk, period. And instrumental to develop this narrative was also Ursula von der Leyen, by the way. She was in 2021, and so she was adamant in propagating this idea of Emmanuel Macron that it was an international treaty, but it has never been an international treaty. So again, the whole perception we have of the conflict comes today it's a moment of truth for all that, because our misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the conflict now comes exactly in confronting the reality. And that's what the Europeans are facing today. The Europeans are facing their own contradictions somehow.
Yeah, I like what you said, that the Russian logic, that at least it makes sense and it's consistent, because again, since the 90s they've been saying the same thing. That is, if we try to construct a Europe without Russia by expanding NATO, it would unavoidably become a Europe against them. So hegemonic Europe under NATO would then become an encirclement of Russia. It would be a continuation of Cold War policies. It would, it would become an existential threat, which they would have to counter it. So they've been saying the same thing for over 3 decades, and you see the same in the specifics of this conflict as well. What often I'm often accused of being more sympathetic to the Russian argument, but it's also because it often makes there's more logic there because at least it can be discussed. When you go to conferences in Russia, you can discuss the arguments they put forth over the past 3 decades. What often dismay here in Europe is there is no discussion of the position, and it's very unclear what the position is because they one day they're recognizing, yes, of course, like Macron would say, Russia has to be a part of Europe, otherwise we're going to have future problems. And the next day, no, NATO doesn't have anything to do with this, just the Russians being hungry for territory. So there's no consistency. They keep jumping back and forth. And if you challenge some of this, even with cold hard facts, which can't be dismissed in terms of the long track record leading up to this, there's always this tendency to lean into the Hitler analogy. Well, he's Hitler if we don't stop him now, or we're always reliving 1938 in terms of Munich. There's this approach which is always so propagandistic. Everything is about the personality of Putin. We don't talk about national interest. It's just that what a bad man Putin is, with his KGB background, and still, if one isn't the argument hasn't been killed, we go into censorship and cancellation. So it's just there's a very dishonest argument, and I think we're fooling ourselves by refusing to see the situation as it is, because then there's no way out. But that kind of took me to my last question, which you already partially answered, I guess, which is, what are the Europeans doing here? Because they do appear to be in a panic. This is how they're responding to it. But as you said, if there's a worse deal tomorrow than there is today, it's in your national interest to make a deal today. And as we've only seen over the past 2 days, the collapsing front lines, especially north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians are just pushing 11 kilometers into undefended territory in one day. It's kind of remarkable, and we see that this is intensifying and it's getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians. So if we're losing the war, that is, NATO is losing this proxy war, and why not make a peace? Indeed, this whole push to get Ukraine into NATO, this would put NATO in a direct war with the world's largest nuclear power. Even the objective doesn't make any sense. So, and I don't hear any good counter argument again, besides having to stop the new Hitler who wants to restore the Soviet Union, all the yada yada. But what is with the panic? Why? Are the Europeans reading the situation differently? Is there just a strategic vacuum? Is it about the Americans leaving Europe, or is it the need to deal with a Russian as an equal who was supposed to sit quietly in the corner of Europe? I mean, what is it that I mean, I like you, I reside here in Europe, but I don't understand what they're talking about. I don't understand the argument they're putting forth.
Oh, I think we answered the question. You answered the question too, because in fact the problem of the Europeans is that they don't have a strategy. They don't know what they want to achieve. They don't have an objective. I mean, beyond weakening Russia, which we don't see that happening, but they don't have a real objective. And since they don't have an objective, they cannot have a strategy. And in fact, when we talk about, when we look at Europe, we see they don't have a position because their position is a narrative. That's what they have. They have a narrative, but not a position. And today, the problem is that the narrative is not very strong. And in fact, they changed the narrative because the whole thing was about weakening Russia, and Russia has no economy anymore, has no oil anymore, is just a gas station. They had no artillery anymore. They have no tanks anymore, no army anymore anywhere. But today we see that they are still threatening Europe, and even the French chief of staff sees France as the primary target of Russia within 5 years. So we see that there is no position. We are just hawking stories. That's all. Meaning that by not knowing what we want to achieve, we cannot define a way to go where we want to go. And that's very apparent in the whole process of negotiation we have seen in the last couple of days. Because what we see is that instead of thinking about how we can cope with Russian demands, the whole effort of the Europeans is to see how they can come up with a common position. So they negotiate between themselves instead of trying to address the problem. So they are fighting the problem in a certain sense, instead of trying to find a solution. And this is, in essence, what we have seen not just for this conflict, but also for other ones. You see the conflict in Palestine, and suddenly you have Emmanuel Macron saying he will recognize Palestine, and within days, all the others start recognizing Palestine. So what are their national strategy? What is their national interest? Suddenly, everything changed just because France emboldened the others. So meaning that all these guys, you mentioned, you said the word strategic vacuum. And I think that's exactly where we are with Europe. We have leaders in Europe who have very poor political culture, who are, in my view, intellectually incompetent for the duties they have been put in charge for. And the problem is that even if they are intellectually too weak to understand the situation, they have not the wisdom to have advisors who can be more clever than they are. You know, when I was kid, I was younger, let's say, not kid, but younger. We mocked Ronald Reagan because he had not the reputation of a big intellectual. He has been an actor and all that. This guy had something very special because he knew that he had not all the intellectual capacities to do his job. So he surrounded himself with advisors who were able to advise them properly. And the advisors he had were extremely good and wise. And at the end of the day, Ronald Reagan, and we can criticize his policy and his economics, the Reaganomics and whatever, but at the end, he left a very good memory because he had this wisdom of choosing good advisors. And that's when you see Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and all these guys, you say, but where are those advisors? They are probably even more stupid than the leaders themselves. Therefore, and we see that there is no strategy for none of this conflict. I mean, we have in the last 2 years or 3 years, we had the conflict in Palestine, we had the conflict with Iran, we had the conflict in Azerbaijan, Armenia, all these conflicts, and the European is absent. There is no, although this should be a primary interest of the European Union as a collective body, or probably some countries within this entity, but they are nowhere to see. When we seek an answer to the Iranian-Israeli problem, where are we looking to? I mean, we are looking to Washington. We're not looking to Brussels. The same for the Palestine. And nobody thinks about looking at Brussels because nobody expects Brussels to provide any kind of response of that. We're not even looking, as it was probably the case a few decades ago. Some would look at Paris, Berlin, or London, or Rome to have at least someone who can provide a solution if the European Union was not able to do that. But nobody even thinks about those guys because these guys are not even able to provide solution to their own problems. So there is definitely a strategic vacuum, but I think behind the strategic vacuum, there's an intellectual vacuum in Europe among the leadership, especially. And I think that's what, the problem is that every time, and you pointed that problem also, that if you try to represent the situation, then people will say, oh, you are pro-Putin, you are a Putin lover, whatever. The question is not whether you like or not Putin. The problem is that there is a problem. And regardless of how you like it or not, I mean, the Russians, you can like or dislike the Russians, but the fact of the matter is they will take Pokrovsk. The fact of the matter is that the Russian army is moving ahead. The fact of the matter is that Ukrainian is withdrawing. The fact of the matter is that Ukrainian soldiers are deserting and all that. We can probably add some narrative and some stories about some Russian defecting and so. That probably exists too, but it has not the dimension you have in Ukraine. And that's the reality. And when you have to elaborate some plan or strategic decision, you have not to base on who you like or who you dislike, but to base on the reality that's happening on the ground. And my concern, because we're back to the discussion we'll have on Friday in Alaska, my concern is that probably we will not achieve any result because Europe doesn't want to have a result, because that would be granting rewarding Putin. That's just stupid. We would just find a solution in order to preserve what remains from Ukraine, not to reward Vladimir Putin. In any case, we might well end up this round of discussion without a result. And what will be the outcome? Well, Russia will continue to proceed on the ground. It will continue to destroy systematically Ukrainian forces, and we will have a point where the Russians will come at the door of Kiev, as it was the case in March 2022, and then the Ukrainians and the Europeans will be forced to accept whatever the Russians say, because they will have absolutely no other option to oppose to the Russians. They don't have much option today, by the way, but they haven't realized this. But if we wait some months, probably we'll come to the point where the Europeans will realize. I think today, for instance, I think, I mean, again, I'm not in contact with Zelensky, but my personal feeling is that Zelensky must probably sincerely regret not having signed the agreement that he made in April 2022. He probably regrets having listened to the Europeans at that time. And I remember it was not only Boris Johnson, it was also the French and the German who prompted Zelensky to withdraw his own proposal. Very important to say, that was a Ukrainian proposal. It was already signed by the Ukrainian delegation, and the Russians were happy with that and were ready to sign it. But Zelensky withdrew his own proposal at the request of the Europeans. And I think today he must probably severely regret that, because that would have been the opportunity of his life. He didn't do it, and today we'll be forced in something much more inconvenient and disadvantageous for Ukraine. And that's a dramatic. I think the Europeans have been really the most perverse entity in that conflict. I mean, we can talk about we can discuss the relevance of U.S. interest in weakening Russia, the way Russia responded with the special military operation. We can discuss all that. Somehow, the U.S. and Russia had the feeling they defended their own interests, wrong or right. But the Europeans, they have no interest at stake in that. They were completely outsiders. And instead of playing the role, what they could have done as a mediation and trying to solve the problem before 2022 and after 2022, they play ball with Ukraine. They became a party of the conflict instead of being the person in the middle. And therefore, they played a very perverse role because, and today you see that the US would like to withdraw and find a solution. And now Ukraine, if Ukraine would be alone in discussing, probably it would open a dialogue, more dialogue, I would say, with the US in order to find a solution, probably even find a way of dialoguing with Russia in order to solve the problem. But now what's happening is that the Europeans are encouraging Zelensky not to talk and not to comply with what is obvious to everybody. And they don't take the risk. They are just pushing Ukraine in front of them. And Ukraine is the country that is, in fact, suffering for the whole thing. The Europeans are quietly behind and pushing Zelensky towards, and especially today that you have the US wanting to not probably not solve the problem, but at least to calm the problem. Why the Europeans are still considering themselves as a party of the problem of the conflict? That's something that is totally ununderstandable to me. I don't understand that.
Well,
There are so many opportunities that were much more constructive that could have been applied in order to help, really help the Ukrainians. Because today, Ukraine is losing people, those who have emigrated. And it's interesting when you see in the media here in Belgium that a lot of people say, I mean, Ukrainians who have been refugees here, but now they're settled here in France, in Belgium. They are very capable people, and they are extremely talented to learn a foreign language such as French and all that. So these are people who integrated very quickly in the society. They were, of course, very well welcomed by the French, the Belgian, and all that. And today, most of these people have married. I mean, I know several people who have married a Ukrainian on both sides. I mean, men married a woman and or Belgian woman, and vice versa. And a lot of people have also, because they are able, because they are educated, they found a job. So for them, turning back to Ukraine is almost excluded, especially in a country that has been totally destroyed. The result of that, and you see exactly the same thing in Poland, by the way. The result of that is that now we see Ukraine having a depleted economy and everything is getting destroyed and all that. Who will rebuild Ukraine? Which money? With which
that's another problem
for,
by keeping the war going, and not only losing more men and territory, but the
exactly,
ability to
yes.
actually have a viable
Yeah.
Ukraine with people living there rebuilding it, I think is gone.
This is just insane. And Europe has played a very perverse role because for them, having all these Ukrainian in Europe was a kind of propaganda to say, oh, all these guys want to be Europeans. And today, what you see, it's very interesting. You see, recently you had when you had all this issue with the NABU and SAPO. I mean, the whole issue with the corruption offices and all that in Ukraine. You had Yulia Tymoshenko addressing the Rada and asking to disband these organizations that are headed by the Westerners. And Yulia Tymoshenko said it's time to decolonize from the West. So meaning that you have now within Ukraine, they start to understand that the West has not, especially Europeans, and when you see, of course, there are ultra-nationalists, we also have to say, but when you see the demonstration, and I've seen myself when I was in Ukraine, see demonstration from the ultra-nationalists, you see the European flag, I mean, the flag of the European Union with a red cross across the crown of stars, because a lot of people they understand that the European Union is probably not the solution they want. So we have here Europe that use Ukraine as let's say for propaganda. I would almost say for propaganda purposes, and Ukrainians who start to realize that they are misused by the Westerners, and they probably need to have an independence, certainly from Russia, but also probably from Europe as well. So we are entering a very strange situation when we observe the situation within Ukraine now. And that shows that what the Europeans have done to Ukraine has not been to help Ukraine. In fact, the objective of the Europeans was always to weaken Russia, not to help Ukraine. And that gives the answer to your question. Europe is not ready to cope with the coming situation, or a situation where you have some kind of appeasement, because they don't know how to do that. They know how to weaken Russia, but they don't know how to help Ukraine. And they will probably not even have the resources to help properly Ukraine in order to rebuild Ukraine and all that. So I think the role of the European Union and the Europeans at large has been extremely perverse, extremely negative, and probably it's almost the most negative of all the actors, to be honest.
I don't think this policies towards Ukraine and Russia could have been possible if there had been some intellectual honesty, though, because I remember back in 2014 when they toppled the government, I said, there's going to be even at the university in Sydney, I was warning, there's going to be a disaster. And, it said, oh, well, that's a pro-Russian argument. If you support Ukraine, you support this. And, but then they wouldn't have lost any men. They would even have had Crimea. I said the same thing about Minsk. If we cancel this, which everyone says is the only peaceful path to resolving the conflict, then war will be the only option. And again, this is also pro-Russian because, Minsk was not fair. And, you take this all the way to Istanbul and now, and even today or yesterday, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, said that, well, we have to accept that, certain territories will remain de facto under Russian control after the war. I mean, if someone had said that 3, 4 days ago, that would have been a Kremlin talking point. It would have been Russian propaganda. It would have been pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian. It's just they, and this it's all dishonest. If we're allowed to say the most obvious things and have an actual discourse, they wouldn't have been able to destroy Ukraine and in this way which they did. But here we are.
Totally agree with you. This intellectual dishonesty, and that's very interesting. I mentioned, for instance, the story of Crimea. When you see historian, and I have read many articles talking about Crimea and Russia and all that, but none of these historians mentioned, for instance, the referendum of the 20th of January 1991. Because obviously this is something that goes against the general wisdom that Crimea has always been Ukrainian, period. And this intellectual dishonesty plays in two ways. The first is obviously what you refer to, which means that you had this kind of thinking that prevents censorship, I would say, kind of an intellectual censorship that prevents anybody to say something that is against the commonly accepted narrative. That's the first thing. But there is also the active part. That means those who have deliberately distorted history in order to create a new history, literally. And so the academic world must be also taken, in my view, to some responsibility with that. But also, I mean, you are from the academic world, I'm from the intelligence world. And the intelligence world is certainly the first one who should be considered as responsible for that. Because at the end of the day, the rationale for having a strategic intelligence service is to provide the decision maker with some kind of rationality, fact-based information, you know? And when you see people like Macron, Keir Starmer, or whoever making obviously bad decisions, then you can ask yourself two questions. Is this guy listening to his intelligence services? Or the second question is, do intelligence services do the right job or do their job properly? Because if you start to analyze from a very factual point of view the situation, then you would come to everything we have discussed during this program. And then, well, the decision maker or politicians can take their decision, but they should take the decision knowing that their decision is not in tune with what their intelligence services say. It's not in tune with the reality. Their decision is based on some kind of alternative reality or a perception of reality, which is not what their intelligence services say. And again, I always say, because that's that was my previous job, but strategic intelligence is a central, not a central, but an important element of the rule of law when governing a state, because that prevents the leaders to take decision out of the blue and make decisions based on nothing. The intelligence should provide the objective elements for decision making. And what we see today, we have when the chief of staff of the French army says that Russia has a primary France as a primary target within 5 years, you ask yourself, where does he get the information? I mean, nobody has ever said that. We are. I mean, if you analyze the Russian armed forces, you can see that they are not prepared for an offensive through the whole of Europe. They are certainly not prepared to occupy the whole of Europe, and they have never expressed the idea of invading Europe. And they never expressed even the objective of doing that. I mean, why would they do that? Why do they have France as a primary objective or primary target? Why? Because they like the Eiffel Tower? You know, these kind of declaration out of the blue without any rationale is for me the expression of a deep intellectual weakness, to use polite terms. It's a deep intellectual weakness because simple educated people would suddenly ask them, why that? I mean, they want croissant for the morning. Why do we want to come in France as a primary target? Make no sense.
No, but you can
And
make these statements without substantiating it with any evidence, but this is the climate we have now. That is, if you contest it, say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, whose side are you on then? Are you taking the sides of the Russians? I mean,
exactly,
I
yes,
noticed the same in this country. You can say like ludicrous, just makes no sense. There's no evidence, but you can say Putin eats children for breakfast, but then actually CNN has news reports that he bathes in reindeer blood. But who's going to oppose it? Who's going to criticize it? Going, well, that doesn't make any sense. But, then you will take the side of the Russians. And the only thing they want to know is you're sitting in the trenches with us. You pick the right side, then you repeat the same narrative. So we're in this strange situation. You can say anything you want, and then no one will want to counter it. And, restore the Soviet Union. Yeah, sure, why not? This is what they want to do. What does it mean? Do they want communism back? Are they gonna, annex Kazakhstan?
Yes,
there's no logic. There's no evidence. Nothing. Just
exactly.
repeat it, or you're part of the enemy. It's yeah.
That's explained why Europe has no strategy, because how can you base a strategy on such just statements? It's not possible. And that's exactly the problem. That's why the European leadership is in crisis today, because they have no response to the situation that Trump created, right or wrong. But that's a situation we have, that he wants to talk to Vladimir Putin. And nobody has a response for that, because the only response would be that Putin is a bad guy, don't talk to him. But this is just problem fighting instead of problem solving. And this is exactly the situation we are. But again, listen to Annalena Baerbock, listen to Kaja Kallas, listen to Ursula von der Leyen. What can you expect from these people? I mean, these people are not up to the mark, intellectually, I mean. They are just focusing on one enemy. Again, this is the say about the hammer and the nails.
Yeah.
This is they have a hammer and Russia is their nail. And it's always Russia, Russia, Russia. Even if you have some tax in the beds of hotels in Paris, this is Russia. I mean, everything is Russia. This is just insane.
Yeah.
And
Donald
what is
Tusk went out on Twitter saying now that the Ukrainian nationalists getting into fights with Polish people on the streets of Warsaw, that this is Putin's doing.
yeah,
So, so there's,
everything is Putin.
but
I
there's
mean,
no evidence. Who would ask for
uh,
evidence? Because then you're taking the side of Russia. So it's so.
exactly.
Ah.
Yes.
Anyways,
Just incredible.
Colonel,
Anyway.
thank you so much. It is no, it's well, I'm trying to be optimistic about this. At least
Yes. I mean, we have to be
something.
optimistic, because at least we start to talk.
Yeah.
I think the very idea that you accept talking, and at the end of the day, some have said this meeting will be, whatever the result is, it's a success for Russia, because for the first time, a leader, a significant leader, a Western leader, talks directly to Vladimir Putin, which so far has been almost excluded by all other leaders. So we have already a positive aspect. And I think the move that Trump started, and again, I'm a very critical about Trump, but we have to admit that he initiated good things. And the fact that he started to resume diplomatic relation with the Americans is already a good start, because that's the very beginning of any problem solving, is to have the ability to talk to each other and to exchange views. And that's a first step. It's probably a very small step, but it's a step. So far, if we would expect something from the Europeans, we would have just nothing,
Yeah.
because they have not been able to elaborate any kind of solution, or not even solution, but let's say a strategy to engage into some kind of solution of the problem. No, they don't want a solution. So at least we are here. We have started, resumed the dialogue with Russia, and I think that's a positive step. That the US is taking the lead in that is a good thing in itself, because we know that even if Trump doesn't want to accept the fact that it's a US war, and it's Biden's war, not the US. But in any case, even if he has the political weight and a geopolitical weight over Ukraine and over the Europeans in order to at least push for a solution or push where some improvement of the situation. Let's put it that way. I'm not sure it will reach peace because that will require some time. Again, nobody knows, but given the discrepancy we have between the Ukrainian/European view and the Russian view at this stage, I'm not sure we'll have a quick result, but the first step is first to talk to each other. If we achieve that, I think we have already achieved something. So I agree that we have to be optimistic for that.
I agree. So yeah, thanks again. And yeah, I look forward to speaking with you next time. Thanks.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.